The safe sat like a punctuation mark at the far wall of the penthouse office, a dark, hulking rectangle that did not belong to the glass and steel of Audra Langden's life. It had been bolted into the floor long before she had a vote on a board or a line in a press release, long before her father's face filled the portrait over the fireplace, and people stopped calling the company Starling Labs and started calling it the Langden Legacy. Now the city lit itself in the windows behind her, a cold, constellated approval. The safe absorbed the light and gave nothing back. She had found it by accident, or as near to an accident as anything tucked away by a meticulous man could be. A loose seam behind a built-in bookcase, a gap between a ledger and a ledger-shaped box, and then the edge of black metal. Her fingers had brushed it, and for a moment the office smelled like wood polish and cigarette smoke and the afterimage of bad speeches. The memory of her father's hands had felt absurdly near. He had loved locks. When she traced the dial with one fingertip, something tightened in her chest with the familiarity of unfinished things. There was a folded scrap of paper jammed under the ledge, brown coffee ring at the margin, a hurried hand. It was not a will or a check. It was a schematic, a rough napkin drawing of a mechanism, annotations in tight script, and next to it a short line in a different, blunt hand. Starling Unit, Safety Downgrade, Approved. A name threaded beneath the second line, like a signature dragged across a page. Leland Croft. Audra folded the napkin into her palm, as if holding a physical accusation. She could have called security, the outside counsel, the auditors with their soft shoes and sticky pads. She could have placed it on a polished table and watched the company dissolve under the bright lamps of compliance. But Leland was a chess player who never stood where you expected him to. He had been soft-voiced and fixed his hair in public smiles for 20 years. He chaired the board and had a way of translating a crisis into a reason to consolidate power. Audra knew how fast a thing like this could be swallowed. Paper, memory, a janitor's confession. There were some truths that died for want of stubborn hands. She thought of the janitor who smoked in the freight elevator and once, impossibly, had calmed an industrial centrifuge when the alarms had gone off 3 years earlier. She thought of the way he had gone quiet after the fire in Lab 7. His name was Penn Calder. He had been an engineer before he'd taken to the nights and the mop bucket, before grief had taught him to make himself invisible. If anyone could coax a safe into speaking without fixing its teeth, it would be him. Audra sat on the edge of the leather sofa, the napkin folded like an accusation in her fist, and she let the city hum at her like a distant jury. The safe was a problem and a promise.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Tenth Jury. The safe was a problem and a promise. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental.
Because if this is what I think, calling security is the same as feeding the fish. She let the last part land between them. You'll owe me, Penn said. You don't have much of a ledger these days, Audra said, and there was something softer at the edges of her voice. Come by after midnight. I'll make it worth your trouble. He hung up before she could offer a promise, and she waited with the napkin in her palm until the city slid into a kind of measured night. She thought of Willa's drawings folded into the refrigerator door, of a child for whom hospitals were a revolving door, and hope was a currency. She thought of the ways companies kept their machines running and let people burn in the process. Penn's apartment was above a florist and 2 doors down from a bar where the light never fully went out. The hallway smelled of citrus cleaner and old rain. Willa sat on the sagging couch with a box of crayons balanced on her knees, drawing a small bird with an exaggerated beak, the starling mark now made in a child's hand, smudged at the edges with purple. Her inhaler waited like a patient thing on the coffee table. The apartment had the warmth of someone who mended what he could. A coat hung over the back of a chair, dishes rinsed and set to dry, a mechanical drawing pinned above the stove like a relic. Dad? Willa's head turned, hair in a tangle, eyes raw with that peculiar child fatigue that comes from too many appointments and not enough sleep. "Are you working tonight?" "I'm fixing something," he said, and the lie was the kind that made his throat tighten. He had not told her the truth, that he'd been a different kind of man, that he'd tried to fix heavy things and had failed once in a way that would always haunt a corridor. He had not told her about the safe or the napkin. He did not tell children the business of old grief. She slid the crayon back under her arm and leaned forward. "Can I see?" she asked. He pretended to hesitate, then reached for the small mechanical case he kept under the kitchen sink. A slender collection of files, tweezers, a paper clip that had been uncoiled and rehardened by heat, a slim pick he'd shaped with his pocket life years ago. He didn't use the word tool. To Penn, tools were faith in metal. He set them on his knee and watched Willa trace their outlines with a slow, serious hand. "You know why I do this?" he asked. The question was a confession more than anything else. Because certain locks are stubborn in ways people are, and sometimes a person needs to be opened. She nodded solemnly, like a small jurist. "Like Mama?" "Like Mama," he said. Aura's name arrived in the room like cold air. Willa drew the bird again, only now she added a tiny door beneath it. Penn closed his eyes so that the room might remember when it had been different. He took the subway down to the Langden Tower at midnight and moved like a presence that did not demand attention. Audra met him in the shadow of the boardroom corridor, the safe behind a disguised panel that had been installed by someone thoughtful of permanence. She had left the office lamp on and a cup of coffee cooling on the conference table. Even in the artificial night, she kept the air of someone who was used to assembling her face. Controlled, minimal gestures, the CEO's armor that had kept her functional through lawsuits and losses. He set to work with a focus that was almost ceremonial. His fingertips found the dial like a patient surgeon. He listened with the kind of attention that had once calibrated turbines and once, disastrously, ignored a smell that should have been an alarm. The tumblers clicked, an almost private Morse. Audra watched him, not trusting her hands not to tremble. The safe yielded after a long, intimate resistance, an exacting surrender rather than a collapse. A small pop, the breath of metal finding relief. Inside, the first thing that lay on a velvet tray was a leather-bound notebook with a starling insignia stamped in worn silver. Beneath it, a thin manila envelope bulged with documents. Pen's fingers hovered over the notebook as if over something that could be alive. Audra's throat closed. The notebook smelled of engine oil and libraries, of a woman's perfume that did not belong in a lab. Ara's initials, A.M. Calder, were embossed in the first page, tiny and precise. Pen's jaw went tight. The manila package rattled faintly when he lifted it. Paper, the weight of paper. She drew back a little, like someone who had touched a sore spot, and rather than aching, something bright and inexorable moved through her like a current. The first thing they found were the kinds of things that do not get remembered in PR campaigns: internal duty memos, procurement lists, a document stamped for external archiving that someone with a fondness for paper had never sent. There was a safety downgrade memo with a file number that matched the napkin, hand-annotated margin notes in a second, different ink, signed by a name she knew by heart and blood: Leland Croft. There were notes in Ara's hand about an alloy used in a containment chamber, sketches for a restraint that should never have been modified, and a small folded list of storage unit numbers with dates. Pen read them with a steadiness that made Audra's skin prickle. He didn't look up when he noticed the chain of annotations in Ara's handwriting, comments that suggested she had flagged a hazard and been overruled. They filed it under cost-saving, he said. That's Leland's language. Audra's mind leaped to the implications. The safe in her father's office had held not only family keepsakes, but the residue of a decision that might have killed. She felt the room compress into one long note. Every memo a lever, every signature a hinge. The documents suggested a pattern, not one incident, but a calculus. Cost cut, safety compromised, testing trimmed, standards shifted.
A very phrase, safety downgrade, felt like an obscene euphemism for omission. There are ways to expose a company that look like violence, and ways that look like patient surgery. Audra had a reputation for the latter. Rushing in with a leaked photograph of a memo was likely to trigger lawsuits engineered from the outside in. Leland's people were practiced at diverting storms and making survivors apologize for their own dissent. She had learned that evidence needed a spine of its own. Hard copies, corroborating invoices, stock procurement manifests, signed delivery receipts. A digital trail could vanish with a click. A storage unit with boxes had witnesses, paid rent sign-offs, and receipts. The napkin gave them a number and a place. "We need the off-site archive," Pen said. "Those storage numbers, if those are boxes with originals, we don't go in half-cocked. We need to lock the chain of custody." Audra let herself breathe, feeling the weight in her chest loosen by fractions. "There are legal ways to requisition them," she said, "but they'll be watched. Leland controls the audit committee, and he's pushing to push the board to approve his consolidation plan next week. He'll have people already combing for anything out of place." Pen kissed the inside of his wrist as if sealing a promise he did not speak. "We do it like we mean to keep it. We get receipts, we photograph manifest copies, we get signatures, people in the facility who will testify.
We make it impossible to claim a clerical error. He spoke the language of a man used to making physical things stand as proof. He thought in bolts and tolerances. He measured truth by how it lay in a palm. Audra, who had carved out an empire using press statements and spreadsheet intimacies, found herself listening to him and wanting to follow his procedure like an incantation. "You'll need help," Penn said after a long moment. He swallowed. "There are cameras, access logs. I can bump a feed or two, but I can't be everywhere. If Leland's people are watching, we'll need someone inside who doesn't think our motive is villainous." Audra thought of Ian, her assistant, who kept the calendar and the soft notes tucked into her planner. She thought of Garrett, head of engineering, who had the kind of loyalty that sometimes confused timidity with fidelity. There were people in the company who still remembered Ara and who resented the way she had been smoothed away after the fire. There were engineers who had kept her notes like contraband and who still resented that Leland had shifted funds from safety to a lucrative line of consumer devices that had doubled quarterly profit margins. "We'll move tomorrow," Audra said. "We'll get the notarized manifests, the rent receipts, the procurement receipts. We'll build a chain so tight no council can burn through it with a press release." She felt the taste of iron at the back of her mouth, the taste that came with righteous certainty.
"And I'll make sure," she started, then stopped. The rest hung like a private sentence. Penn watched her for a long time. "You don't have to promise me anything about a job," he said finally, thinking of Willa's inhaler and the ways medical care felt like a fortress with a closed gate for people without influence. "You don't have to promise me the moon." "I'll make sure Willa gets what she needs," Audra said. It was less transactional and more covenantal. She would use the company's resources to provide medical access and to set up a fund for families affected by negligence. She could not bring Ara back, but she could make the company accountable so that other families would not need to bargain for survival. "I'll use my position to open doors that Leland has sealed." Penn's face softened in a way that made him abruptly human in the electric light. He let his fingers curl around the edge of the safe, feeling the residual coolness. "We do this clean," he said. "No leaks, no theatrics. If you want Leland gone, we do it with evidence so loud they can't paper over it." Audra nodded. The plan formed with the kind of slow certainty of a machine engaging. They would go for the storage unit in the morning. They would get hard copies, cross-check them against procurement manifests, build a chain of signatures, and find witnesses, people who had been instructed to bow in memos that had no teeth. She would marshal legal counsel discreetly and set in motion the kind of internal motion that made a boardroom feel a lot smaller. The morning arrived with a thin December spit of rain, a city washed and alert. Audra drove in a company sedan she did not usually take, windows fogged, her reflection in the glass a double of the Langden portrait she was trying to outrun. The storage facility was 3 blocks from a suburban strip mall and smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. It looked like many other things in the city, essential, neglected, slightly embarrassed to be useful. The unit numbers on the napkin matched a cluster in aisle F. The keypad at the gate took an access code that could be logged. There were cameras, small and unblinking, perched like insect eyes. They worked fast and quiet. Penn moved among the units with the ease of someone who had once known the spine of a warehouse. He carried a tote of mechanical tools that looked like a tailor's case: picks, files, a small lamp. Audra had called in a favor to an archival consultant in the company who owed her a past kindness and an old favor to Ian, who had found an invoice for an off-site archiving contract that had been irregularly routed. They arranged a notary to meet them for the receipts. They arranged for a courier. Each step was a stitch in the fabric they meant to make impossible to pull apart. The first unit they opened had the smell of paper left in dry heat, like the scent of a book that lived under a bed.
Cardboard boxes, each labeled in a hurried script, sat stacked against metal shelving. A box marked Lab 7, R&D, Do Not Destroy, was the size of a small coffin. They lifted the lid and found decades of Starling's private life. Memos, product cards, procurement slips with stamped dates and signatures, test reports scrawled with red comments that spoke of rushed tests and curtailed protocols. There were delivery receipts that had been initialed by an innocuous G.H., who, according to company HR, had retired the year before. There were physical ledgers, the kind that a liar respects, the way a lover respects a ring. Satisfied, but not yet safe, Penn photographed each item with Audra's phone, but made sure the original stayed pristine. He logged each item in a paper manifest and had the notary sign. The movement of paper beneath his fingers steadied him. He had believed in legible things his whole life. They found the memo stamped Safety Downgrade in a grease-marked folder, folded and annotated in 2 hands. The Leland signature was clean, and next to it, in Ara's tiny shorthand, a note: "Do not proceed without third-party verification." The note had been ignored. Audra felt her breath box in her ribs. In the back of the unit, tucked under a crate with reusable glassware, she found a shallow box of personal effects. A bracelet with Ara's initials, a small stack of personal notebooks, and tucked between them an envelope with a single photograph. Ara smiled in the photograph, hair wet as if she had rinsed it after a lab run. She looked younger than Audra had remembered. Penn's hand closed around it as if to hold the woman in place. "You keep this from me?" he asked. Audra lowered her eyes. "They buried the records," she said. "They made it look like a tragic accident. I never—" She felt the sentence dissolve in an absence of a lifetime. Penn rested his other hand on her shoulder for the briefest possible moment, a clasp of shared history that was not sentimental because both of them had no taste for that. "We take it slow," he said. "We get the manifests notarized. We photograph everything. We get witness statements. We get the rent receipts. If Leland tries to argue clerical problem, we drown him in ink." They left the unit with the weight of paper between them and the constancy of cameras overhead. They had done the physical work of creating an unignorable archive, but the work to translate that archive into institutional accountability was something Audra had always done in suits and with polished language. She knew how to turn evidence into narrative for a jury of shareholders and outside counsel. Penn's job had been to make the truth tactile. Together, they had something like a plan. They met for coffee in a deli that smelled of frying onions and oil.
And there, away from the sterile light of the office, Audra allowed herself a small admission. "There will be pressure to settle," she said.
It was not a prediction. It was a map. Penn looked at her then, in the way he had looked at the safe, holding her attention to see the mechanism's truth. "Then we make it so a settlement looks like complicity," he said. "We make it so the board has to choose between complicity and reform. The where of reform would be in the boardroom, and the how would be in the witnesses they had lined up. The retired engineer who had taken an early retirement. The procurement clerk who had a conscience and a documented trail. The lab tech who had scribbled 'pressure valve replaced' in a notebook and then been reassigned. Each witness would add a stitch to the pattern. Each invoice and signed receipt would be another hand on the scale. What Audra did not yet expect was the way the personal and the institutional braided themselves together. When a boardroom is exposed to the sun, it is not only a company that burns. Reputations, families, and histories do as well. She felt the old portrait of her father looking down at her with a blend of accusation and love she could not untangle. She thought of Ara's notebooks on the passenger seat and of Willa coloring the starling bird with a little door under it. She thought about what accountability would cost her. Enemies, a career, the neat world of boards, and her father's good name. But she also thought of something that felt like her father in a better light. What responsibility to truth had to be when a culture of profit takes precedence over people. They were careful. Ian printed the manifests and typed memos at 2 in the morning, and then deleted the temporary files once a copy had been notarized. Garrett quietly produced internal lab photographs that had been misfiled and accepted a transfer out of the R&D leadership unless he was reinstated on terms of transparency. The porcelain of the company's public face was scraped, but not shattered. And yet, Leland was Leland. He ran his fingers across the mahogany of the boardroom table as if touching the wood might smooth his future. He spoke in a voice that could be velvet and the blade in the same year. He rallied signal-carrying board members with a fluency that made Audra's palms sweat when she sat across from him. He offered the kind of conciliatory language that died teeth first in the mouths of men who had already prepared their defenses. He did not so much deny as recalibrate. "There's no evidence of systemic failure," he said. Words that slid over the napkin like oil. He smiled with a practiced smallness. "Circumstances are complex. We'll commission an internal committee." Audra listened to his syllables fall into the air and watched him place a cup of water in front of her as if he were showing hospitality. He tried to neutralize the vector of proof by making language slow and bureaucratic. He had not yet seen the paper they had stacked like a weapon.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "They had seen the paper they had stacked like a weapon." Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental.
The handwriting was excited and meticulous, a mind that loved detail and hated the complacency of corporate cost-cutting. Audra had drawn a version of a valve that allowed a containment weld to push beyond safe tolerances. She had written, "If they do this, they will call it efficient, and someone will die. If it does, who will be accountable?" The question at the time had felt like a technical curiosity. In the light of the memo, it read like a plea. Penn came by with Willa and with a lunch he had made that looked intentionally and lovingly plain. A sandwich cut into neat triangles, a thermos. Willa hugged Audra without fuss, because children have a merciful way of moving past adult complications. Audra's hands were small in the hug, and for a moment the three of them stood like a makeshift family, an alliance not of blood, but of chosen will. They walked into the boardroom at noon together. Cameras were there. The board had called an emergency session for reasons that had nothing to do with their plan, and everything to do with the uncomfortable rocking the documents had already started. Leland smiled on the other side of the table like a man with a diploma tucked into his pocket. The room had a smell of polished wood and expensive coffee. When Audra presented the documents to the table, she did so with a surgical calm that made the room lean forward. "I will let these speak for themselves," she said. She laid out the chain, the safe, the napkin, the storage units, the notarized manifests, the procurement receipts, the witnesses who would testify that they had been ordered to prioritize profit margins over tests. She watched faces change as if watching a body come to consciousness. Leland's face did not change. He merely placed his hands together and said in his softest voice, "We will conduct an internal review." But now the company had the smell of a wound, and the wound would not close. Audra had presented the documents in a way that made a board spin, because to deny the chain would be to deny notarized papers and the testimony of people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. The board could opt for a settlement, for silence, for a small administrative reprimand. Or it could accept its culpability and act. In the quiet after the documents were placed on the table, Penn felt the old, calibrated rhythm in his chest, the slow, mechanical heartbeat of things about to move. He had come here for a safe and for a woman who had been important to him once. He had not come for this much public exposure. Willa sat beside him with her small hands folded like a petition. Leland asked for a recess to consult counsel. As the room cleared, Penn and Audra remained, their shoulders nearly touching. "If they push back," Penn said, in a voice that had been iron and a soft thread, "we push louder." Audra turned to him, an almost private smile cutting the tension. "We promised to do this clean," she reminded him. "No leaks we can't control." He nodded. In his coat pocket, he still had the photograph of Audra. He had been a man who thought in salvage, and in salvage he found himself singing small songs to the image of the woman he had loved. For reasons he could not completely articulate, he had never told Audra everything. She had not asked. But now they had the safe opened, and the city outside had no idea how tight the cord of accountability was about to become.
They left the building in a drizzle that had turned the city's lights into smeared watercolor. Audra's phone buzzed with unseen messages, lawyers who smelled the scent of a conflict, Leland's emissaries who wished to speak quietly. She folded the napkin into the leather notebook and felt its small accusation like a key. They had what they needed to move. They had the paper spine. But none of them knew whether the truth would be delivered with the steady justice of a court or the messy collapse of public opinion. They had only the feeling, like the thrum of a machine warming up, that things were in motion, and that once the safe had been opened, certain doors could not be closed again. Penn watched Willa walk ahead with a childish briskness that made his chest ache and his hands want to repair things beyond his reach. Audra felt the weight of her father's portrait, past and requirement, still settled over her like a mantle. They had opened a safe and found that it kept more than paper. It held the residue of choices, a map that could either lead to healing or to ruin. Across town, in a private suite of the Langden Tower, Leland Croft reached for his phone and dialed a name that did not echo in corridors of ethics, but in the quieter rooms of influence. He did not swear. He did not shout. He planned, which for him was the same as asserting. Outside, the rain intensified, as if the sky itself had decided to witness the unspooling. Audra and Penn walked on with the documents safe in their possession and a fragile plan like cigarette ash between them. They had set the gears in motion, but the boardroom held 1,000 small levers. The next days would test whether documents could outlast men, whether paper and signatures could compel a culture that had prized profit to examine its soul. They had opened the safe. Now they would have to open doors that run deeper than metal. They did not sleep much that night. Willa dreamed of birds and doors. Penn mended a small metal pin and tucked it into her pocket in the morning, and felt the small domestic victory of a father who could still do small, useful things. Audra rehearsed her statements and called a third-party investigator she trusted more than she trusted anyone on the board. The city moved around them like water around a stone, and the stone had only begun to sink. What neither of them had counted on was how quickly loyalty would calcify into resistance. The board broke into factions, and Leland began a slow, surgical campaign to recast the evidence as unfortunate mismanagement.
It cast the evidence as unfortunate mismanagement. He leaked an innocuous-seeming memo suggesting procedural confusion. He began settling with one of the smaller witnesses, an act that smacked of bribery masked as compassion. In that instant, the battle sharpened into something that was not merely legal, but moral. Audra called Penn and told him. He drove back to the storage unit and watched a courier collect one of the boxes that had not been logged in their manifest. Someone had been here. Someone had changed the ledger. It was a small act and a terrifying one. It meant their chain of custody could be attacked in court. It meant Leland was not merely defending himself, he was active and clever. They moved faster. They subpoenaed a log from the storage facility. They found that a payment had been made by a shell company 2 weeks prior, an invoice that matched the courier's pickup. The courier's license plate number came up as a rental, registered under a name that had a shell company behind it. The legal game was on, and Leland had already placed his pieces. At 3 in the morning, Penn returned to the safe in Audra's office because he could not leave the thing closed. He stood before it and ran his thumb over the dial as if checking the pulse of the lock. He thought of Aura and of the way light had seemed to exit her presence when the lab gas had done what it had done. He thought of Willa and of the way children inherit a world made by someone else's choices. He thought of Audra, of the way she could make decisions that made people safe or unsafe. He knelt and laid his palm on the safe, and, absurdly, as if in apology, he coaxed the lock once more. It responded with the same small, private click. They had opened the safe. They had found proof. They had begun to assemble the architecture of accountability. But they had not yet opened the last door, the one that would allow the public and the regulators to see the truth in a way that could not be undone by legalese or friendly payouts. The day of the emergency hearing arrived like a delivered verdict. The boardroom was fuller than before. Cameras that had been kept at bay now pressed in outside the doors. Leland took his seat with the calm of a man who had practiced for a long time how to smile when someone else was in peril. Audra had her materials printed and bound. Penn sat in the second row with Willa at his side, the little pin catching the light like a promise. They had witnesses, and witnesses had witnesses. And the quiet knot of evidence began to look like a rope that might pull a building upright. When she rose to speak, Audra felt a strange clarity. Her father's portrait watched like a benign judge. She placed Aura's notebook on the table as if laying down a life. She spoke in the voice she used for crises, straightforward, cold, precise. She laid out the chain in the space between the table and the ceiling. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The paper and signatures did it for her.
Leland rose after her and offered a practiced apology that had the edges sanded off and the center intact. He spoke of unfortunate errors and grief and the company's commitment to rigorous review. But a company cannot speak to grief and then bury the documents that show a hand at work. The board felt the pull. The votes balanced like scales. Then, just as the room hummed with that precarious silence, a man from procurement walked in and asked to speak. He held in his hand a small folded receipt that had been misfiled only hours before by an assistant who had the temerity to keep an honest ledger. The receipt had a name written on it that had not appeared in any of Leland's lists. Someone in the back of the room recognized it. A judgeable pause ran through the room. It was the moment when the scaffolding began to creak. Audra watched as the board's faces shifted from self-protective placidity to the discomforted shape of people who had suddenly realized how close they were to complicity. Penn sat rigid, Willa's fingers tightening on his coat. The documents had begun to speak in a chorus. Outside, the city had no idea how quiet a revolution could be when paper was allowed to speak. But inside, the quiet was about to be shattered by the other thing they had not planned for. A man with more than a soft voice and a boardroom advantage would not yield without more than a polite fight. The safe had been opened and had given them proof. Now the real work of translating paper into change had only begun. They had to be fast and they had to be clever.
They had to make sure that when the votes were taken and the lawyers filed their motions, the truth had been rendered not as an allegation, but as a series of demonstrable acts. The air shifted. Someone cleared a throat. The hearing was not yet concluded. Outside the glass, rain skimmed the pavement like a wet argument. Inside, the boardroom shivered toward the place where a man's reputation could be stripped and rebuilt. Audra felt the safe under her skin like a compass. Penn rested his hand on Willa's small head as if to anchor her to what they were doing. They had opened one closed thing. Many more remained. They were not yet finished. The man from procurement smoothed the receipt with 2 careful fingers and held it up as if it were a page torn from the room itself. The name on the top line read like a private joke meant to be taken seriously. Halden & Co. It was not a name in Leland's lists. It was not on any ledger his people had shown before. Someone in the rear, an assistant from legal, pale and suddenly certain, said, "That's the shell we used for consulting last quarter. The payments went through that account." Silence grew teeth. Leland's smile thinned. The practiced pallor gathered at the corners of his eyes. He opened his mouth, closed it. He looked toward the door as if a friend might be arriving there to offer a momentary reprieve. "Who paid it?"
"Who paid it?" Audra asked. Her voice had the flatness of cataloging evidence. There was no pleading in it. There was only the need to place acts against names. The procurement man read aloud the smaller entries. Dates, amounts, a notation that one line had been for facility remediation oversight. The handwriting on the folded stub matched a signature that had been on the invoices they had pulled from the safe, a signature that, when traced, connected the consultancy to a private trust whose beneficiaries included a single name on the board. Leland's jaw worked. He took a breath, as if to dress his reply in the clothes of reason. "Procedurally," he said, "this should be referred to counsel. There are matters of privilege and of confidentiality. We cannot allow—" "You can't allow what?" Penn interrupted before Audra could stop him. His voice was low and steady, and behind it was the steadiness of a man who had spent nights learning to carry a new kind of fear. "You can't allow us to see the pattern? To see the payments that paid for the cover-ups? That's not a privilege, that's evidence." A murmur traveled like wind through dry grass. The board shifted uneasily in their chairs. Some hands crept toward the edges of papers as if to hide from the facts. Others sat like stones, immovable until told otherwise by numbers on a ledger. From the back, a woman in the communications office stood. "If we do not act now," she said, voice shaking in the way of someone who had not planned to speak, "our silence will be read as approval. The regulator will take greater action if they hear that we obstructed an internal review." Leland's face hardened into the shape of a man who had always believed the world would obey the scale he held. He engaged the meeting's counsel, the one who had never spoken in public rooms without a prepared paragraph stitched into polite law. "If we rush," he said, "we risk an injunction. We risk damage that cannot be undone. Or we risk continuing what's already been done," Audra answered. She placed Aura's notebook open before the room, the pages having weight now like anything that could not be returned to silence. "You said there were errors, Mr. Leland. We have names attached to dates.
We have payments that correspond to the exact times the plant diverted its procedures. This is not a matter of tone. It's a matter of whether we will bring it to the people who must adjudicate it. Someone in the boardroom, a director from compliance whose career had been a string of incremental advances and small satisfactions, pressed her fingers together and said, "We can form an independent review. We can appoint counsel unaffiliated with current management and begin an audit. We can also notify the regulator. If these are the facts." Leland cut in, quick and infected with panic now. "You'd hand over proprietary processes? Our partners would sue. Our stock would tank. This is corporate suicide." His hands moved like someone trying to gather up a spilled country.
A voice from the hallway answered him before anyone could, a voice like an edict. "If the facts are true, Mr. Leland, the only way to avoid greater harm is immediate cooperation." It belonged to a man who stepped into the doorway then, colder than the rain, better suited in temperament to negotiation than to friendship. He wore the posture of someone accustomed to deciding who would keep what. He had been seen in the corridors of influence before. His entry was the kind that altered the pitch of a room. Leland's shoulders unlocked when he recognized him. "Garrett," he breathed. Relief and alarm breeded into a single syllable. "You've come." Garrett did not smile. He folded a business card between his fingers and dropped it onto the table like a gauntlet. "I represent several shareholders," he said. "Some of them are not pleased to learn that money was routed through consultancies to avoid scrutiny. I recommend you allow an independent exam. You will also want to preserve chain of custody. That safe, how long has it been in the custody of corporate security?" Audra felt a small lift at the word preserve. Chain of custody was a technical phrase that could make a case iron. "We have logs," she said. "Security signed for it. We have photographs and timestamps. Aura documented the lab orders in her notebook. We're prepared to certify this." The board chairman, who had been silent most of the morning, cleared his throat. He was an older man, slow to anger and slower to speech, the sort who had once been known for careful decisions. "This room must agree to an independent external audit," he said. "We must also agree to temporary suspension of anyone whose actions are implicated until this audit is complete." All eyes turned to Leland. He steadied himself into a posture he had used in many meetings, one that suggested he bore responsibility but not guilt. "Suspension would be premature," he said, the words practiced. "I will fully cooperate, but we must not let emotion drive the decisions of sound management." "Then we will let the documents drive the decision," Audra replied. "The documents are our evidence." A vote was called. The counting was slow, a sort of ritual that let people align themselves visibly with the future they preferred. 2 dissenters, 3 abstentions that were indecisive enough to be their own condemnation, and the majority, narrow but decisive, voted to call for an independent audit and to alert the regulator. The chairman's gavel was a small sound, but it snapped the room into motion. There was a flurry then. Phone calls hushed into pockets like birds. The board secretary began to type a formal request, and a compliance officer left to author the notification to the regulator. Leland stood for a moment after the gavel fell, as if he could will the floor to adopt a different gravity.
At the doorway, Garrett inclined his head. He met Audra's eyes without a trace of triumph.
There also would be a deadline in which to act. She walked to the window and looked out. The city's wet blinds caught the light and then let it go, as if the world itself had decided whether to reflect or to absorb the day's news. Cameras angled toward the glass, lenses like patient mouths. In the reflection, Audra saw herself smaller than she felt, and yet, because of that, clearer. The safe's click still echoed in her bones. They had opened one closed thing. Many more doors remained. She threaded her fingers through Aura's notebook and whispered, not to the room, but to the small, unvanquished memory of a friend who had insisted on speaking the truth. We will not let this be quiet. Behind her, the board resumed its procedural voice, but the rhythm had changed. Outside, the rain smeared the city's faces into something more honest. Audra breathed once and then moved to the next task, because doing justice was not a single motion, but a catalogue of small, relentless acts. They were not yet finished.